I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Hello and welcome to the Essential Geopolitics podcast by RANE. In this special episode, two of our analysts will be sitting down for an in-depth conversation on the state of U.S. Russia talks surrounding Ukraine. Ryan Bohl, RANE's Senior Middle East and North Africa Analyst, and Matthew Orr, RANE's Eurasia Analyst, are here to explain the likely direction and implications of the upcoming U.S. Russia negotiations. Hi Ryan and Matthew, how are you both doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having us, Emma.
Hey Emma, it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, so we've looked at the Russian side, and we're assessing that their war exhaustion point hasn't hit a tipping point yet. But what about the Ukrainians? What's the status of morale? We have stories from media about soldiers not showing up, about Ukrainian troops having to do, impressments of civilians off the street. Casualties are also high for the Ukrainians, and the economy there is also not doing terribly well. And of course, 20% of their country is now occupied, especially their industrial regions are occupied by the Russians, and they're not able to ship things out as readily as they used to because of the disruptions in the Black Sea. So what is our assessment then of Ukraine's war resolve? And is there a reason for us to believe that they too will be able to make another year of hard sacrifices?
Yeah, that's the right next place to take the conversation. I mean, look, the Ukrainian people, first off, I think one of the sentiments that's very widespread in Ukraine is that they don't feel that they necessarily have a very obvious choice other than continuing to resist, right? I mean, from their perspective, it's very much, well, if Russia decides to continue the war, that's not a choice of ours, right? It's a choice of theirs. And the jump is not immediately to this kind of this fantastical idea that there is a hypothetical settlement that can be had, just because ultimately Putin can continue the war, and it's Russia's choice. And so unless Ukraine has very obvious leverage to very clearly, through force, through power, convince Russia that that's not a good idea. And so for them, yes, they very much think that it's about kind of Western resolve and Western support, and whether there's the political will and the financial capability and all these other things, production, right, military production capability to give Ukraine what it needs to actually win the war. I mean, that's certainly how many of them would look at it. But that being said, no, it's true that there is kind of widespread exhaustion in Ukraine. Everybody in Ukraine wants the war to end, right? They feel the human costs of this very acutely, right? Because they know, how many of their citizens are mobilized and are at war, and everything about the mobilization procedures and measures and regime is the number one topic of conversation in Ukraine. If you go to Ukraine, all over the streets, you will see billboards and advertisements and public service announcements and all kinds of materials about mobilization, about the various units of the Ukrainian army that are independently going out and trying to recruit soldiers, right? And it's quite interesting because there is a bit of a competition mechanism within this, where basically Ukrainian units try to outside of formal mobilization members try to do their own things to incentivize recruitment into their ranks, right? Ukrainian army units want to be seen as the good units that take low casualties, that are well equipped, that have direct partnerships not mediated through the Ukrainian state government, but through private entities or various charity funds, etc., have relationships with Western entities that allow them to get access to military equipment and other things like that. And so that competition is very much underway. But the state of the conversation in Ukraine is about, what do we need to do further on mobilization? And in general, there is this whole discussion of lowering the mobilization age even further in Ukraine. It was around the time of a mobilization law that was passed last year, April of last year, which lowered the age from 27 to 25. It did help. It helped for several months. There was a very clear uptick in monthly intake in the Ukrainian army, but it appears that the effect of that law has largely run its course, in the sense that now that monthly intake of new soldiers has again fallen to levels roughly what they were around the time that law was passed. And so they're again back at this point where, to keep up with the Russians, who have a population that's so much larger, they have to take deeper and deeper and deeper measures just to kind of maintain parity, even though the Russians are taking more casualties. And so, yes, everything about what measures will be taken is probably the number one topic of conversation within Ukraine, and you really can't escape it. And in general, the Ukrainian people do not want to lower the mobilization age. Right? The idea is it's very painful for the Ukrainians, this idea that they need to lower the mobilization age when they feel that the West is really still not even providing sufficient support to stop the Russian army, right? And they cite all these examples, right? Like the failure to produce sufficient long-range fires to support the Ukrainian army, the slow pace with which key systems such as Western tanks and aircraft, you'll remember the story, the long saga of the F-16s and so forth, when in fact there's actually thousands and thousands of F-16s in the world, and there's thousands of Western tanks sitting on lots kind of within NATO countries and so forth. And so they feel that it's somewhat cynical for example, the United States to tell them to lower their mobilization age when the United States is still sitting on a gigantic stockpile of equipment, but is still not willing to reach deeper into that stockpile to help the Ukrainians now, and very clearly gives some sort of firm guarantee that if Ukraine mobilizes X number of more people, they will receive X amount of, X, Y, and Z systems, right? From the Ukrainians' perspective, they want this to be very much a negotiation where, in exchange for further mobilization, we need some sort of guarantee that the Western equipment to actually arm those soldiers in any clear perspective will also be there, because mobilization comes with immense costs for Ukraine. Every time the mobilization age is lower, first off, it's diminishing returns, right? There are fewer 24-year-olds than 25-year-olds. There are fewer 23-year-olds than 24-year-olds, and so forth, because of Ukraine's poor demographic curve. And so it just doesn't make sense unless it comes with kind of more clearly defined promises from the West on the military equipment side. And so the Ukrainians are worried about, taking measures in this direction, lowering the mobilization age, but then just prompting two things. First off, the negative effects on the Ukrainian economy, right? It has all kinds of negative effects, including, the biggest is causing more people to flee Ukraine, right? You have more draft dodging. That's even worse for the demographic curve. Moreover, it creates further demands, and this actually fuels corruption in Ukraine by increasing the demand for the few number of exemptions from mobilization that are made available to the workers of key economic enterprises and businesses, right? It increases the kind of black market cost of receiving one of these jobs that comes with a mobilization exemption, and so it fuels corruption in that way. And so from the Ukrainian perspective, they're definitely open to it, and my forecast is that we actually will see Ukrainian measures to lower the mobilization age in the coming months, but they're going to do their best to make sure that is absolutely tied to some form of clearer and greater support from Western powers, and including from the United States.
So let's then jump out to the foreign influence in this war, which is obviously particularly important for the Ukrainians. And let's shift over to the West, and we can start off with the United States and its approach, because that has changed, hasn't it? We now have a new president with a new administration, and setting aside the political rhetoric of ending the war, instantly in 24 hours, etc. We know that the White House's strategic goal in Ukraine is to end the war, and they seem pretty flexible about the ways that they would achieve it, if their end goal is nevertheless the end of this conflict, that President Trump is coming in claiming to be a peacemaker. But at the same time, as you've noted, the whole of the West has been reluctant to put its full proxy powers into Ukraine and providing them this heavy equipment that might give them parity with the much larger Russian military. So let's walk through some of the drivers as to why has the West remained reticent to provide that support, and what do we expect to change in Western support with the new American administration and its skepticism towards foreign interventions broadly?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think at least in the initial years, there was a lot of things. If you go back to 2023, right? Remember the preparations for the Ukrainian counteroffensive. I think that after Ukraine didn't immediately buckle under Russia's invasion, as some people seem to think they would. We, of course, here at RANE did not think that at all. We knew that if this full-scale war started, that it would definitely be very much an enduring, long-term quagmire and not this quick special military operation. But then once that didn't happen, I think there was a bloated kind of sense of optimism in the West that maybe Russia was some sort of a paper tiger and that maybe the Ukrainians could kind of push them out. And it was that very optimism that actually somewhat prevented the Western powers from making hard and fast investments in many of the capabilities, the production. I'm talking about investments in military production, things like expansion of anti-air ammunition production, certainly artillery shells and other things. They were very slow on that. And now that we're paying the price for that, because those things needed to be well funded from within months of the invasion starting, particularly considering that the U.S. was aware of Russia's seriousness about going through with this invasion months in advance. Right? It seems strange that these kinds of expansions were not already kind of ready to be authorized as soon as the war started. But yeah, they were very slow on that military production side. And I think that, right, it's changing now somewhat with the Trump administration. With the Trump administration, the motivation is a very clear strategic one, right? The Trump administration is very invested in this idea of countering China in the Indo-Pacific, and see kind of this, there's a very kind of literal belief about how to go about doing that, which is that we actually don't, right, this idea that we don't have enough equipment to deter China, and so we actually can't reach as deep into stockpiles, and we don't necessarily need to expand production of systems needed by Ukraine, because we actually need to send that equipment. And if we do expand production, it needs to be going to ourselves, our Indo-Pacific allies, of course, like countries like Taiwan, Japan, etc. And so it's part of a very clear strategic calculation on their part that I don't think that kind of the really some of the key people are willing to reassess. That being said, we know that there are various factions within the Trump administration, different thoughts on this. For example, I mean, I know that there's some people in the policy department of the Pentagon, people like Elbridge Colby, have a different view on this than, say, for example, Special Envoy Kellogg, who is actually kind of Trump's main emissary to kickstart some sort of Russia-Ukraine, U.S. Russia negotiation about Ukraine. So, right, there's lots of differing opinions. Yeah, I mean, I there's probably still somewhat of an optimism about, just, things will sort themselves out, and kind of an unwillingness to believe that we are very much going back to an era where Russia is going to still pose a conventional military threat to Europe for a long time. And we need to kind of go back to not necessarily a Cold War level of spending in terms of as a percentage of GDP or anything like that, but certainly below the times of the so-called peace dividend and how low Western countries were spending on defense and what they were spending those defense dollars on previously. And to touch on Europe very quickly, I mean, we cover it all the time in our own country. I mean, in our own company, countries like France, the United Kingdom, even Germany are having all kinds of issues with potential sovereign defaults and worsening bond spreads and needs to relax their debt restrictions. Right, these are high debt economies, and the U.S. also has a lot of debt, and so just because of this essentially this financial constraint, many European countries in particular are reluctant to expand defense spending now. In terms of why, again, I think maybe there's a false hope that that the Russian threat will somehow recede. Again, kind of going back to this thinking that Russia's in terminal decline, and kind of Ukraine is their last gasp, etc. But no, I think in general it's not a secret within NATO that Russia poses a very clear conventional threat to NATO, of course, and to not just to NATO, right? Russia also poses a conventional threat to the rest of its periphery. And so I think that maybe some optimism or some unwillingness to see that threat might just be out of a kind of strategic optimism that maybe if we pursue this a kind of a policy of appeasement towards Russia, maybe we can go back to some normal more similar to that which existed prior to 2014.
With the last few minutes we've got here, Matt, I'd like to, as a team, we do what are called blue skies, right? We go outside the box and we imagine things that are still within the realm of possibility, but they're not our baselines. There are scenario Bs and Cs and Ds. And I'm thinking about, the way this ends. And maybe it's not this year or even next year, but all wars do end. And as a Middle East North Africa analyst, I just recently saw a war that I never thought was going to end the way that it did, which was Syria, where the Assad government collapsed very suddenly because of strains that we had seen for many years. We just didn't know that those strains could be fatal as fast as they were. And so thinking about the way this war could end, in which maybe one side has a sudden collapse. Other ways that the war could end in which it's almost like a World War I situation where the war exhaustion gets so high that there is, again, a revolution on the other side. And then that side is willing to come to terms with the other. So it's not the annihilation of one country or one regime, but a détente caused by, or a new balance of power caused by revolution. And then there's also the Korea angle, which is what folks have pointed out since the very beginning, that there is now an East and West Ukraine, a Russian-dominated section and a Western-dominated section, and then we just face off for the next however many decades along the Dnieper or along the Donbass or whatever that is. And thinking about those three options, the idea that one side suddenly collapses, the idea that one side has a revolution and is forced to give massive concessions, and then the third one, which is that we're looking at a divided Ukraine in the long term. Where are you leaning these days? What are you looking for to help understand perhaps those three different options?
Yeah, no, I think that's kind of an interesting perspective. I mean, I know that really since the opening months of the war, people have been saying and have thought that this war, may not end until we see one of the leaders leave office. That is, of course, either Zelensky or Putin. And I think that, you could quite convincingly argue that situation is still the case. And as I said much earlier in our conversation, based off of Putin's rhetoric, he still seems very obsessed with this idea of new political leadership in Ukraine and that Zelensky must go, because Putin essentially sees that as the source of any legitimacy of any peace agreement that gives him what he wants, right? And so, in terms of thinking about kind of the drivers for the actual end of the conflict, I think that looking at the situation of the two leaders is definitely one of the very productive lenses to look at. President Putin is 71 years old, but he's not under immediate threat, right? Of course, the kind of the black swan, the wild card that could change everything is that if all of a sudden his health seemed in question, and there was talk of a succession in Russia, that would be immensely destabilizing to Russia, and that would certainly change the situation. But that seems like a very, as I said, black swan, remote scenario. And so what I think we're looking at more likely is this kind of this thought of more pressure on President Zelensky domestically, and somehow that being related to the end of the war. Of course, the rock and the hard place for Zelensky is that right? It's almost no leader is going to agree to an end of the war that is political suicide for them, right? If the war ends and we get some sort of a Minsk III situation, the Minsk III being a sort of a continuation of the Minsk II agreements that were supposed to that were supposed to regulate the war in the Donbass that started in 2014. If you look at the Istanbul agreements, right, the first draft document that Russia and Ukraine were discussing in April of 2022, it in many ways is kind of a continuation of Minsk II, and that's why it was called Minsk III. And so the whole narrative in Ukraine is that we can't accept a Minsk III. We can't. If the result of the war is just getting a continuation of the terms of that were present since 2014, but now Ukraine has lost so much of its territory and even more people, then Ukraine needs to get something in exchange for that. That is very much the sentiment in Ukraine, and so I think that if Zelensky can't deliver that, then that is what's supposed to be very destabilizing to Ukraine, and that's what's supposed to potentially be a subject of peace negotiations and this idea of new elections in Ukraine. The problem with that, though, is that if Ukraine becomes highly destabilized as a result of some elections or change of political power related to the terms of preserving any sort of ceasefire, of course, that itself becomes an avenue for Russia to eventually resume the invasion under even more favorable terms, where the Ukrainian government is in some sort of chaos and has even lower legitimacy, even lower public support. And the hope is that eventually that will, in several ways, affect the ability of the Ukrainian army even to be able to continue defending itself, right? And so, I think that the places I would look are Western support. Is Western support sufficiently high to really deter Russia, or is Russia in enough economic pain for them to actually reconsider? There will have to be a combination of measures applying very strong pressure to Russia on the economic, political, and military side to get Russia to stop. Otherwise, then I think at least if we talk about the near term, then any sort of durable end to the wars is definitely quite far away, in my opinion.
Well, Matt, this has been fascinating, and it's great to have a conversation about some of these deeper trends. And it's also nice for us to remind our listeners that we do products like net assessments, where we really look into the deeper geopolitics of great powers like Russia. I wrote one on Turkey, you wrote one on Russia. We are working on others for other countries that are updating our deep bench of how we look at these countries structurally. Matt, I really appreciate you coming on and having this conversation with me today. I hope this was fruitful for you as well, as a way to think about different things going forward. And keep an eye on Polymarket. Let's see what the wisdom of the crowds thinks in opposition to your forecasts. And of course, if anybody is interested in our forecasts, you should go to our website, the RANE Worldview website, which is where we host most of this.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I really appreciate it, and I do keep an eye on those betting markets, and I will continue to do so going forward. I think that there's plenty of opportunities for some investment in arbitrage, because I think that as has been the case for a while now, there are all kinds of discrepancies between maybe some of the image in the head of Western publics or Western leaders versus the situation in Russia and Ukraine itself.
Thank you again, Matt, and we will see you again in the future.
Subscribers can read Matthew's recent article on the topic in our platform, but for more risk insights and analyses, visit ranenetwork.com, where you can learn more about our suite of risk intelligence products and solutions. That's RANE network.com. Thanks for listening.